My name is Shandy Hannah. I'm the president. I keep forgetting. I'm the newly appointed president of RI NOW. And I want to thank everybody for coming today. I want to thank the Social Justice Committee here at the church for partnering with us on the roundtable series. It has been a really great partnership. And Cecile has been here setting up and will help break down for us as well at the end. So thank you very much. We're really happy to be doing this. And I appreciate everybody coming out. I know it's a few days before the holidays. Our work never ends, so here we are. We have Vanessa Volz and Rachel Oring here, and they're going to talk to us a little bit about domestic violence and what it looks like here in Rhode Island and how we can help. So I also want to thank our board members who are here. Our newly appointed Vice President, Amanda Clark. We have Robin Covington here as well. Laura Costa is here, and Ashley Perry is here, as well as some of our legislative committee members are also here. So thank you everybody for coming. We have a lot to learn about tonight. So just talk a little bit about the roundtable series. This is part of the work that we do with RI NOW. Legislative advocacy is a big way that we can eliminate barriers for women in Rhode Island. And this is a piece of what we're doing. And so every legislative session, we do lobby trainings, we organize lobby days, and we get people out there to help work on the issues that we care about the most. And the roundtables here are just a way to prep everybody going into the session, so you already have a little bit of an idea what we're looking at in different issues. So as I said, Vanessa and Rachel are here. They're going to talk a little bit about themselves and their organizations. They'll talk about domestic violence on a national front and then how it affects us here in Rhode Island. Before we get started, I do want to thank my mom and my grandma who both came out to support us. My mom especially as a survivor of domestic violence and myself as well. This is an issue that really affects our family and touches us very closely. So I'm glad that you've come out and learned a little bit more about what we're doing here. So thank you all, and I'll turn it over to you. We'll probably wrap up around 8:15. If you have questions, feel free to raise your hand during the program or at the end. Okay, so let's get started. Thank you.
So I'm Vanessa Volz. I'm the director of Sojourner House, and I do want to extend a thank you to Rhode Island NOW for inviting myself and Rachel to come out today. I got involved with Rhode Island NOW actually when I first moved to Rhode Island over 8 years ago. I've been a member ever since, and Carolyn Mark was one of the first advocates I met when I moved here, so it's an organization that I think very highly of, and it's very nice to be here talking with you all tonight, so thank you for having us. So I am the director of Sojourner House. Sojourner House is one of 6 member agencies. We're all a member of the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which Rachel works for and will tell you a little more about. But as a member agency, we provide direct services to individuals who have been impacted by domestic violence here in Rhode Island. Because of the nature of domestic violence, we do wind up bringing in clients from other parts of the country, notably Connecticut, Massachusetts, sometimes New York. But the majority of the clients that we work with are Rhode Island residents. And the agency was formed almost 40 years ago now, in the mid-1970s. We were formed by a group of Brown University students, faculty members, and alumni who were very concerned about the issue of domestic violence from a social justice perspective. They saw gender inequality and domestic abuse as these large social justice issues that needed to be addressed by the public, and they got together and started having meetings at the Sarah Doyle Women's Center, which is still in existence on the Brown University campus. And from that, the agency of Sojourner House came to be. And the first program that the agency had was a hotline that volunteers, completely volunteer run at the beginning. Volunteers would rotate answering the phone to provide advocacy and support to victims. Later on in the late 70s, early 80s, they developed an underground housing network where people would offer up rooms in their individual homes to victims that needed somewhere to go. And then in the mid-80s, we purchased our first residential property, which is a shelter that is still in an undisclosed location, and it is full almost every night. 30 years later, unfortunately. Since that time, we have expanded as an agency, so in addition to shelter services, we now provide what's called a transitional housing program, which is longer-term housing for survivors. Families can stay in our program for up to 18 months. which really gives them more time to get back on track, find housing, childcare, set some goals for what they need to do, and they get their own individual apartment and not sharing space in a shelter, which is not always the most conducive to someone in crisis. And then we're really excited this fall, actually, we just launched a new pilot program with the Smith Hill CDC, which is going to be a permanent supportive housing project. It's a pilot project, so it's small. We have 3 units. The Smith Hill CDC owns a building. We're going to provide supportive services, but it'll be housing for an indefinite amount of time. There'll be no time limit on how long survivors can stay in our permanent supportive housing program. So we're pretty excited about that. As we look at the history of Sojourner House, what we're seeing is a shift in terms of what housing needs survivors are asking for. It used to be that we saw more clients who in the middle of the night needed somewhere to go right then. We see more individuals now who need longer-term housing, who have been impacted by abuse, and that abuse is affecting their ability to live independently, but they really need somewhere to stay for months or even years, not necessarily just a couple weeks. So we've definitely seen the housing needs of survivors change since we were incorporated over almost 40 years ago. So in addition to housing, and I'm sure when you think of a domestic violence agency, you think of housing, and that's certainly one of our biggest programs, but at Sojourner House, we also run a variety of community-based programs. So we have a drop-in center in Providence. It's on Smith Street, just down from the State House. We're open Monday through Friday, and it's literally a drop-in center where people can come and meet with an advocate. We offer support groups in English and Spanish. We have an HIV testing program, so individuals can drop in and get a rapid oral HIV test, learn their status. We provide sexual health education for individuals that need access to contraceptions or information about sexuality. And we also have an LGBT outreach program. We now offer support groups for the LGBT community. And we started to do a lot of work in the past 10 or 15 years with youth education. So we have a variety of youth programs. We have some Department of Health grants. We do work not just around healthy education work, but we have a grant from the Department of Health to do teen pregnancy prevention, which we see very connected to violence with teenagers. We know that teenagers that are in abusive relationships are more likely to drop out of school and become pregnant before they become an adult. So we've kind of incorporated some of those issues into our prevention program. So those are our main direct service programs that we provide to survivors. And as I said, we are a direct service agency. We don't directly engage in policy work. We're here more to be on the front lines. We have a hotline that we answer 24 hours a day, so we can provide immediate support to victims and survivors who need our assistance. As I mentioned, there are 6 agencies throughout the state of Rhode Island, so we're primarily based in Providence and northern Rhode Island. However, Rhode Island is so small that we obviously will see clients from across the state, and sometimes individuals want to move to a different part of the state to escape their abusers, so we wind up doing work in other parts of the state as well, which I guess is kind of an upside of Rhode Island. We work with the other domestic violence agencies pretty closely, and sometimes we'll have someone in our shelter and we need to move them to another agency because of safety reasons, and that can be facilitated pretty easily here in Rhode Island because it's such a small community. So those are our direct services, and Rachel's going to talk a little more about policy, but I did want to speak a little to, well, it's interesting having this discussion at the end of the year, right? Because as I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about tonight, 2014, what a year when you reflect on the issues of domestic violence and sexual assault in national media, even at the statewide level. When I think back, 2014 started for me, I think it was the second week of January. A woman in Woonsocket was murdered by her abusive partner. I had to attend a press conference and talk about that case, and then it's just been a series of events, not just locally, but nationally, when we think about sexual assault on campuses, how that's been getting so much more attention, when we think about the NFL and Ray Rice, when we think about Bill Cosby, when we think about Rolling Stone and Jackie at UVA. It's just really been a year of talking more about sexual assault and domestic violence. And I think many people would say it's good that as a community, as a society, we're speaking more about these issues. But I think it's important to point out that these are not new issues. These are situations that obviously have been going on for a long time, long before any of us were here for hundreds of years. And I think it's important to focus on, this is not just, yes, it's a policy issue, but I guess the perspective I want to bring to the discussion tonight is an individual perspective. these are real people's lives that we're talking about. And that's something that I see running an agency that provides direct services. And it really kind of put things together for me. I don't know how many of you saw it, but last week in New York Magazine, journalist Ann Friedman, who is a pretty well-known journalist, writes a lot about women's and gender issues. She wrote an article. She called it 2014, the year everyone finally started talking about sexual assault and domestic violence. I would recommend looking it up. It's only a couple pages if you haven't seen it. But she really said something that I wanted to point out and then tie it back to some of the work we do at Sojourner House. She said the upshot of all this discussion about domestic violence and sexual assault is both sad and inspiring. I think we're making progress overall, but at the expense of individual survivors. The Ray Rice case, among others, pushed the NFL to revise its code of conduct. The White House launched its investigation of colleges' assault policies. And California changed its sexual consent standards because the stories had grown so numerous. They were impossible to ignore. Every single person who came forward and exposed what she considered to be a shameful experience, who was subjected to the court of public opinion and threatened as a result, has added to a growing volume of stories that prove, by their sheer existence, that this is a real problem. So my point is that this has always been a problem, and these stories have always been there. We're just now starting to actually have people come forward to tell them. And I have to say that in my role as the executive director of a domestic violence agency, even though I'm not the one providing direct services, it still is overwhelming the amount of stories that people tell me. It just happened this morning, and I wanted to tell you, just again, to make this an individual issue, to make this an issue that we realize this is about people. I wanted to share a couple of stories that people that I have come in contact with since my time at Sojourner House have shared with me. And I will keep it short, but there were about 3 or 4 that I wanted to mention. One that I always think of is a woman who, I actually came to a church service, and I was speaking at about Sojourner House and the work that we do, and the church was a supporter of ours, so I was thanking the congregation for their donations. And afterwards, a woman approached me, and she thanked me. She said that before I'd even been the director of the agency, that she had come to Sojourner House because she had fled a nearby state with her 8-year-old son, and she needed housing assistance so that she could escape an abusive situation. And we were able to shelter her for a couple of weeks and provide her with some basic necessities. And she said within a couple of months she was able to get established in Rhode Island, and she's a very functioning member of society, has a job. Her son and she now have an apartment, and she just said, you know, you guys were there for me at a time when I really needed it. And her story is not unique. We help people like that all the time. I also think about a story that happened while I was the director. I got a call at 2 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon from my board president. He doesn't usually call me on the weekend, so I knew something was going on. And he said he had met with a client on Friday, who had then called him again on Saturday. And she had contacted him because she wanted a divorce from her husband. And he suspected there was abuse, but she called him again on Saturday because her husband had locked her in a closet and left her there overnight. And I guess he finally left at some point Saturday morning and she was able to get out. But she said, is there anything I can do right now to get divorced? She and her husband were from Eastern Europe. She spoke very little English, and we actually arranged for an advocate to come get her that afternoon and transport her to our shelter, where she stayed for a year because she didn't have immigration status. It was very hard to find her housing, but she stayed with us for over a year, and we actually helped her get her green card and a U visa so that she could legally stay in the United States. But she was definitely in a situation of emergency, and we were able to assist her. So those are some of the more extreme cases of individuals that we've helped as an agency. And then I also think about people that I meet just in my daily work as the director. I can't tell you how many people that I meet who are donors, who are hospital administrators, who are attorneys, who are people that have not directly accessed Sojourner House's services, but pull me aside and say that at one point in their life or recently they were in an abusive situation, and they almost seem relieved to be able to talk to someone about it, because there's still a lot of stigma and there's still a lot of shame that people have about talking about abusive relationships. I also think about, before I became the director of Sojourner House, I practiced law, I worked under a mental health grant, and I remember being called out to a psychiatric hospital to represent a patient who wanted to leave the psychiatric hospital, but her doctor was saying she had to stay. She had been pink slipped. She wasn't allowed to leave even though she wanted to. So she called me and she wanted to see if I could somehow get her out. And I met with her. She was a 72-year-old woman from Barrington. She was married, had 3 children who were all grown. And as I talked with her and read her medical record, it became clear that she was suffering from PTSD and had a major depressive disorder and was hallucinating on a regular basis. And as I talked with her, and I had to meet with her a couple times, because clients don't always tell you everything the first time, but as I met with her over the course of a couple of days, it became very clear that she'd been in a verbally, emotionally, and physically abusive marriage for over 50 years. It had literally driven her crazy. And so as an advocate, I explored with her options of leaving her situation. And I still remember her looking at me and saying, honey, I'm 72 years old. He's been doing this to me for 50 years. I'm not going anywhere. And these are the lives that people live and have lived and will continue to live. And it even happened this morning. I went to work. I had a meeting with a professional colleague who came in about 20 minutes late, and she apologized profusely and then proceeded to tell me that last week she left her partner of 3 years because he's emotionally and verbally abusive and she just couldn't handle it anymore. And she looked at me and she said, I feel so much shame that I lived that way for 3 years. And this is someone who works in the movement, who's a social service provider, who understands the dynamics of domestic violence. And so I think it's important when we're talking about this issue of domestic violence to just realize we're talking about individuals that, one thing I always like to point out, because a question that I'm frequently asked as a director of an agency is, why is it so hard for victims to leave? And I get that all the time. And having done this work, and I'm not being melodramatic, but having done this work for as long as I have, my question is always, why does someone leave? Because there is so much judgment in our society, because there are so few resources if you're not financially independent, because there is so much judgment if a relationship fails, that I am always astounded by our clients who do have the ability to leave a bad situation. That to me is the question, not why doesn't someone leave. And it's just important to realize that these are very complicated issues, that relationships are complex, that you can love someone even if they're causing you pain and harm. And that's why agencies like Sojourner House are here. We're here not to pass judgment. A lot of our clients come to us, want resources, seek advocacy, seek our services, stay in our shelter, and then go back to their abuser. A statistic I've seen indicates that it takes a victim of domestic violence up to 7 times to leave their abuser before they permanently leave. So we know that happens. Yes?
Sometimes it's more dangerous to leave.
Absolutely, yes. And we know exactly.
I know someone who was almost killed because she left.
Yes. And we see dangerous situations escalate when someone leaves or someone threatens to leave. And so that's a lot of the work that our agency does too in terms of helping someone safety plan around that. How do you leave a bad situation, especially if you're concerned that your partner really is dangerous? Mm-hmm. Those are real concerns, absolutely. So there are many reasons why someone would leave an abusive situation. But again, we live in a society where we're told to behave a certain way, or a relationship is supposed to be a certain way, when in reality, we know that it's not. So the work that I do, I think, really kind of helps create this, it's very, we see the human side of what domestic violence does to individuals and to families. And a lot of times when I give these presentations and I talk to audiences, I talk about statistics, and Rachel will probably mention a few, and I can mention a few, but we know nationally and in Rhode Island that 1 out of 4 women will be a victim of domestic violence in her lifetime. That's a really large number. That means that if it's not yourself who's a victim, you know someone who's been a victim, even if they haven't disclosed that to you. Just statistically speaking, you know someone who's been impacted. And domestic violence doesn't just impact the victim, the direct victim. It impacts families. It impacts children who witness the violence, because we know that creates a cycle of violence. We know children who grow up watching abuse are more likely to become abusers or to become involved in relationships that are abusive. So we know about the cycle of abuse. We know that it affects the workplace. We know that people who are victims of domestic violence have more missed work days. We know because of injuries, because of emotional stress, it's more difficult for them to attend work. We know that they often have to take unpaid days because of work. We know sometimes they lose their job or their housing because of the abuse. So the impact just is, it's a domino effect and is very difficult. So that's, again, some of the perspectives that we have here at Sojourner House. And because of all that needs to be done to make situations better for victims, we develop policies and we try to get legislation passed. And we work with our friends at the Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And I'll stop talking and let Rachel talk a little more about the policy side.
So my name is Rachel Oring. I'm the manager of government relations at the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And as Vanessa was saying, we're a statewide organization. Every state and territory in the country has a state domestic violence coalition, and we are Rhode Island's. And we represent the 6 main service agencies, the shelters that are funded by the federal Family Violence Services and Protection Act. No, Protection and Services Act. Prevention and Services Act? FIPSA, as we call it. And so we don't provide any direct services to victims ourselves. That's what the 6 agencies around the state do, and that's, if you've heard of them, the Blackstone Valley Advocacy Center up in the Pawtucket Central Falls area, the Elizabeth Buffum Chase Center down in sort of the center of the state, the Women's Resource Center of Newport and Bristol counties, the Domestic Violence Resource Center of South County, and the Women's Center of Rhode Island, which is Providence-based, as well as Sojourner House, which gets the northern part of the state. But what we do is offer a variety of service areas to do advocacy on this issue on a more statewide basis. So we have 3 main areas of our work. One is policy, and so that's going to be the legislative policy that we're mostly here to talk to you tonight about, but also a variety of systems advocacy sort of work. So we go and we talk to the Department of Human Services about whether RI Works is working for victims of domestic violence and work on the programs that make sure that victims, the DHS is not giving out the address of a victim of domestic violence when they're pursuing child support from an abusive partner. Or the Safe Families Collaborative, which works with DCYF to make sure that victims of domestic violence are not being penalized for their partners being abusive if they are going to be a protective, safe parent for that child that DCYF is trying to protect. So different agencies around the state do the direct service in that, and then we do the sort of systems advocacy with the statewide departments, the Attorney General's Office, the Department of Corrections, to make sure that they're remembering how their policies are going to affect victims across the state. Our second area of the coalition is prevention and public awareness. All those billboards you see and some of the flyers that I have over there that tell people about domestic violence in Rhode Island, the bus ads, as well as prevention services, which is a lot of that work is done through a CDC grant that Rhode Island is one of 10 states that has, where we're working on developing evidence-based programs for stopping domestic violence before it starts. It's called primary prevention. So instead of intervention, where you work with a victim after they've been abused, or you work with an offender after they've already offended, this is about primary prevention. And a lot of that is based on the ways in which the public health sector worked on the tobacco problem over the past number of decades, and applying those lessons to how can we change the culture in Rhode Island to make sure that we are not giving people these messages that they ought to stay in these unhealthy relationships. How do we teach children to build healthy relationships? So then our third area is communications. We do a lot of work with the media when there are high-profile cases. Yes?
Isn't SOAR also a member of the coalition?
Yes, I was going to get to that in just one sec. No, totally fine. we've done over the past few decades a lot of work with media outlets to talk to them about how they cover domestic violence. So if you look back at stories when, say, a husband killed a wife back in 1985, you will find that it just there are a lot of quotes. I would say that the standard quote is, "He just loved her so much that he couldn't bear that she was going to leave," and it's written in a very sympathetic way towards the abuser, and often from the abuser's perspective, and using a lot of techniques that over the years the domestic violence community has called out those media outlets and said, you are perpetuating the idea that this is the victim's fault. And I would say that you see a very different tenor of story now. But sometimes they still slip into that, and we end up having conversations. And then, as Jody pointed out, we have a fourth sort of area, which is that we, alone among I think all of the states in the country, we have a task force of survivors. They are not just a speakers bureau of people who can tell their stories, but they're a group of women survivors of domestic violence who get together regularly and discuss what's going on with our policies and our work and inform what we are doing. And so when we come up with policy ideas, we're sitting there in our office and we say, oh, this would make the world so much better for domestic violence victims. We have an extra step to that process before we go to the State House and tell them what they should do, where we go and we talk to our task force of survivors, and they vet our ideas and make sure that we are not missing something about the survivor perspective, and they give us the wisdom from their own stories to inform what we go forward and do. So that's just a really valuable resource that we have here in Rhode Island. Any questions about services before I sort of go into the history of the policies in Rhode Island? Okay. So the coalition focuses on a bunch of different areas in terms of legislative policy. Obviously, primarily we focus on anything that is specifically and primarily about domestic violence. For example, when the Domestic Violence Prevention Act was passed back in the 90s, which made domestic violence crimes and defined what relationships counted as domestic violence and provided special enhanced penalties for people who were convicted of domestic violence crimes. That was the sort of base legislation that, of course, we're going to be at the forefront of. But we also, yeah.
I'm sorry, what year did you say that was?
I want to say that was 1994. No, and that was sort of the cutting edge of when, as Vanessa said, back in the 70s, there was this movement coming out of the feminist movement that really started to talk about how do we keep women safe. But the institutions and the laws were not that fast to catch up. And I want to say it was 1991, 1992, early 90s, there was a woman in Connecticut, in Torrington, Connecticut, and she had gone to the police again and again and again, and she had a restraining order, and she told them, my husband's going to kill me. And they kept laughing her off, they wouldn't respond, and finally he did try to kill her, and he was beating her outside their house severely. The police took a very long time to show up, and when they did show up, they sort of stood around, watched, offered him the suggestion that maybe he should stop, didn't actually intervene physically until he got in the car and started to drive off, at which point they said, okay, and they brought him in. She almost died. Surprisingly, I think she'd both been beaten and stabbed in this encounter, and but survived. And after she was out of the woods, she brought a lawsuit against her town. And she said, this was an equal protection violation. Because you did not take my domestic violence seriously, I was harmed. And the courts decided that the town and the police department had to pay out millions of dollars to her. And as we know, money talks. And suddenly, all of the governments started thinking, oh, maybe we should update our laws. Maybe we should do something about this. And so you see that in Rhode Island was one of these states. In the few years after that case, you have a bunch of states pass wide-ranging domestic violence legislation. And that's when we got the Domestic Violence Prevention Act here in Rhode Island. Right. So,
I think it's terrifying when you hear 1994, when you actually hear how recent.
When I
Right,
split from my abuser, so the whole time.
right. Yeah, so
Yeah.
so here, some of the things that, some of the rules that we have, laws that we have in Rhode Island are, you can sort of see the direct tie from that case to the policies that we have now. For instance, one of the main things that put into effect was a mandatory arrest policy. So when a police officer goes to the scene of a domestic violence crime,
Yes.
and they have probable cause to believe that a crime has occurred between people who have one of the defined relationships that count as domestic violence here in Rhode Island, they have to arrest. They have to arrest the perpetrator. They have to arrest the predominant aggressor. So if you have someone who says, well, yeah, but then they hit me, they don't have to arrest the defensive party. They have to arrest the aggressive party. We try to get them to minimize how many times that they just throw their hands up and say, okay, we're just gonna arrest both of you. Because we know that abusers, the first thing they do when the police walk in is say, oh yeah, they did it to me too, and try to switch it all around. So that sort of policy came out of that set. So in addition to the sort of domestic violence specific laws, we also get involved in a variety of criminal justice, reproductive justice, racial justice, economic justice, immigration, civil liberties, and housing and homelessness issues up at the State House. I like to tell people that, the dynamics of power and control in an abusive relationship involve the abuser trying to gain absolute control over every little part of their victim's life. So you can't spend money without asking me, you can't talk to your friends without asking me, you can't drive more miles than I'm going to let you drive. I can control every little aspect. And because that control extends through someone's life so far, we have to look at every system that is going to affect the life of that victim and make sure that the policies of that area in our state are friendly to victims and are not going to be easily manipulated by batterers to further victimize their victims. So those areas, we don't usually take the lead in those issues, but we will make sure that, for instance, if, let's say the Medicaid expansion bill where family planning services would be covered for a wider variety of women. We know that reproductive abuse is a major issue, and not being able to access contraception when you're on your abuser's health plan, issues like that can be a major impact on victims of domestic violence. So we will make sure that even though the broader issue that's being talked about isn't specifically about domestic violence, we have a voice up there, and sometimes one of our survivors or maybe some of our policy staff are up there reminding the legislators and reminding the state government how it is that this will impact a domestic violence victim. So in recent years, the sort of big issues that have come up, you may have heard of some of these, you may not have. Obviously funding, especially in this recession, has been a major issue. And this is both on the federal and the state levels. You probably heard about the fight for the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization. There was also a fight for the FIPSA reauthorization. Those are the two of the three major federal sources of funding for domestic violence services in our state. The other one is the Victims of Crime Act, which is also usually a bit controversial, just because spending any money right now is controversial. So there have been fights on the federal level to protect that money, and of course a lot of those funds were subject to the sequester when that occurred. And because of those lacks of federal funding, it has really brought the fact that Rhode Island itself, the state funding is minimal here. The state funds very little of the services that are provided. And a lot of the money that they give to domestic violence is part of a series of what are called community service grants. They're a series of legislative grants, not the ones that have people's specific legislators' names next to them, but a different group of sort of these public good grants that from 2007 on faced across the board cuts that led them to be down about 70%. And that's the funding that goes for children who witness programs in the state, which had originally been over $200,000 for Costa State. Still not very much, but is now down to $90,000, I think, for the entire state. And as Vanessa said, those are the funds for the sorts of programs that have been shown to help children who have witnessed domestic violence avoid those bad outcomes that we know are very possible when they don't have some sort of help or stability or supportive adults in their lives. And then the other grant is for the court advocates who are in all of the different courthouses to help people with restraining orders and help victims in domestic violence crimes. And that had gone down from about $425,000, which the program's been around for 25 years. And up until 2007, it was always funded at that level. And it had gone down below $200,000 when we did a big push to try to restore the funding a couple years ago. And we got $100,000 back, but it's still only about half of what it was at its core. And we have about 5,000 people each year who are served in the courts. So as you see, it's sort of a very minimal amount per person that's being served with these services. Statewide, there are about 10,000 people who seek services from the various member agencies each year, just to give you a sort of sense of context on how many Rhode Islanders are currently seeking services for domestic violence. Other issues recently, we've had some updates to what crimes can be considered domestic violence. Research nationally was showing that strangulation was a undercharged and crime that the authorities weren't taking seriously enough. Yeah, I know, when you say it that way. But, strangulation where someone, say, had to go to the hospital or almost died, yeah, that was being taken fairly seriously and probably being charged as attempted murder. But if you didn't have, strangulation is a very potentially fatal crime that doesn't leave marks necessarily. So it was mostly being charged as simple assault, because felony assault was only when you were either did a large injury to someone or if you used a weapon of some sort. So strangulation sort of fell into this loophole where it was mostly being charged as simple assault. People who are convicted of domestic violence, simple assault, in general, well, either the case gets dismissed. We know that about 65% of domestic violence cases across statewide get dismissed on the misdemeanor level. Or if it does get charged, usually they will get a year probation and some batterers intervention classes. And I would say only about 3% of misdemeanor offenders each year get any jail time whatsoever on domestic violence charges. Obviously, if it's put up to a felony, they usually get about a year, at least. So the General Assembly passed a law that would make domestic assault by strangulation a felony. Also, in terms of updating the criminal code, we have a stalking law in Rhode Island. It requires that someone physically follow you around. I don't know about you, but I have my smartphone with me everywhere. It does everything for me. If someone hacked into it, They would be able to know everything about me, everything I talk to anyone about, everything I do, everywhere I go. And in fact, there are very easy to download apps that, like Find My Ex, and various other things that pop up that abusers have been putting on their victims' smartphones. And so cyberstalking has been this sort of very big emerging issue that our laws were not written to be able to address. So I think that's those cyber issues, they address them, and every year the Attorney General tries to update the laws to try to actually get them to have the language to prosecute whatever is actually going on now, because we just don't know how the issue is going to change. So then this year, what we're going to mostly be focusing on as an organization with our legislative agenda is trying to get funding for domestic violence primary prevention, and then trying to get them to pass a domestic violence misdemeanor gun ban. Right now, if you're convicted of a felony of domestic violence, you are not allowed to have a gun under either federal or state law. If you've been convicted of a misdemeanor of domestic violence, you're not allowed to have a gun under federal law, but under state law, you are. This means that the police in Rhode Island don't necessarily think that they can take the guns away, because if it's only under federal law, how is it their business? This is sort of by a department basis. Some of them will, some of them won't. So victims in different places are getting different levels of protection. But in addition, the federal definition of domestic violence only involves people who are married or who have a child in common. People who are dating are covered under Rhode Island law as domestic violence, but not under federal law. So dating violence perpetrators are not getting their guns taken away right now under federal law. So working with the Rhode Island Coalition Against Gun Violence and the Attorney General's office, there's going to be a bill put in that would make it a crime also to possess or buy a firearm if you've been convicted of a misdemeanor in Rhode Island. So those are sort of the two major issues. In our back pocket is always trying to advocate in the custody and visitation systems. The family court is exceedingly unfriendly to victims of domestic violence, and unfortunately has been very resistant to having any presumption that someone who has been convicted of domestic violence should not receive custody or visitation of a child, which we know is a big danger. People who have to do custody transfers can be in a lot of danger from a former abuser.
Do you know if neighboring states have, or other states have this presumption?
A variety of states do. I'm trying to think I think Massachusetts does. New Hampshire, I think, has just put one into effect. Unfortunately, New Hampshire just updated their laws because they had a terrible situation where an abuser at a supervised visitation center shot his son and himself. And so that led them to update their laws. Fortunately, we have not had any front page terrible tragedy in Rhode Island anytime recently. But it is happening every day that the family court is an unsafe place for victims, and that victims are having to decide whether they think it's better to get a restraining order or to keep custody of their kids, and that restraining orders and the safety aspect is being used as a bargaining chip. I was just talking to a woman today who was sort of pushed to drop a restraining order that she felt like she needed because the judge felt like both sides should give a little. So if she was going to get custody and he was just going to get invitation, she should also drop the restraining order. Right. One thing.
The judge's name is?
I don't actually know, but yeah. So, but it does vary. If you start thinking about whether all victims are getting the sort of same level of service, it's going to vary from judge to judge, because Rhode Island's judges have a vast level of discretion over these cases. When we were promoting legislation that would have put in this presumption, the objection of the family court was that it would keep judges from having full discretion. Now, one of the factors that the judges are currently required to consider, along with domestic violence, they're required to consider it. It doesn't tell them that they have to consider it in any given way. But one of the factors is which parent is more likely to promote a friendly relationship with the other parent. It's called the friendly parent statute. So basically, if I'm a victim of domestic violence and I go into the court and I say, this is my abuser, I don't want to have a relationship with him anymore, I don't want to have to co-parent with him, and the abuser, who is often a very manipulative personality type, is coming and saying, I don't have anything against her. I don't know what the problem. Of course I think it's very important that children have a relationship with their mother. The judge is basically told by the custody factors that the abuser is going to be a better custody choice than the protected parent. So already, by the way it is written, it is skewed against victims. One thing we're really excited about and are hoping in the next few years to put forward is Colorado has moved to a system called Safety First, where the judges have to consider the safety of everyone in the situation, parents as well as children, which is good because sometimes judges will say, well, yes, this person is a danger to you, but they're probably not a danger to the kids. Which, given that we know that there is a great co-occurrence of child abuse and domestic violence, makes us raise our eyebrows. But in that case, the judge first has to figure out how to keep everyone safe, and then from the realm of what keeps everyone safe can decide what's in the best interest of that child. So there's sort of models that are starting to emerge, and so that's going to be a continuing issue, because when we talk to survivors, keeping their children safe is one of just the main priorities for any survivors who have children. Yeah. Yes?
I don't know the answer to this, but the restraining orders, I just feel like they're really not very helpful. I mean, you can get a restraining order against somebody, and I mean, you know, a lot of the women that get abused again or even get killed, oh, well, you know, there was a restraining order. Like, I feel like there has to be something that can be done to enforce them more. I mean, I don't know what the answer is, but...
Well, I mean, in terms of the advocacy we provide our clients, we always say a restraining order is a piece of paper.
Yeah.
You know, if someone
Right.
really wants to come after you, they are.
Right.
A restraining order is just a legal document, so if you violate it, you violated the law. But in terms of practicality, I mean, we certainly see abusers violate restraining orders all of the time.
I think that the protection that a restraining order offers is that if that person is banging on your door at 2 a.m, you can call the police and they don't have to be even disturbing the peace or doing anything other than being there, and they can get arrested. So ideally, that's what happens, right? It's it gives you a path to having the police intervene to keep you safe. Realistically, that's again going to vary department by department. You know, VAWA, a lot of the work that the Violence Against Women Act does is fund and promote the training of law enforcement and police officers, and prosecutors and other people in that system. It's going to vary, though. The culture of every department is going to be a little bit different. We have some great police officers in this state who will give victims their personal cell phone numbers and will make sure that they are ready to go and pick up that abuser the next time they show up. And I think we have people who, you know, those good ones, it's because they understand the dynamics well enough that they know, like Vanessa said, that it's going to be multiple calls before that person is ready to leave. And then you have the people who, I would say, they're probably nice people. They just don't really understand this dynamic very well. And the first time they get called out to help a victim, they think they're gonna ride in there, they're gonna make everything better, it's all gonna be great, and the first few calls they respond to, they're doing all the right things, they're arresting those perpetrators, and then they get burned out really quickly because they see that person going back, they're getting called to the same place, and I feel like there is this level of cynicism for a lot of the law enforcement officers that is part of what we're trying to combat with the training. Help them understand why it is that just because you show up and you arrest that perpetrator, it doesn't mean that that person is safe. Especially when I'm saying that only 3% of them are going to get any jail time on most of these minor charges.
Right.
So they're going to be back out in the community. Maybe there's a no contact order, but you're depending on that person for the support of your kids, to pay the rent. It's not going to, the police officer can't fix all of those issues. And then I think there are some people who, there's a certain, they really don't believe that these things are true. And there is unfortunately, just like in society as a whole, police officers are just as likely to believe that, oh, women just make this up to get back at men. So when the restraining order is reliant on the police officers affecting it, I think that it's not about changing the laws about restraining orders, it's about changing the culture of the law enforcement so that they feel like this is an important thing to enforce. I would say that one project that I'm working on that's really exciting right now, where the restraining orders do matter, is that Rhode Island has a critical case review team that the Department of Probation and Parole hosts. And advocates across the state can refer cases that they think are dangerous, that they think are that are on a path towards homicide, that are escalating. And those cases get screened by dangerousness assessments that are based on studies of what factors occur in domestic violence homicides before murders. So some of the major danger factors are, threats with guns, stalking, sexual assault, strangulation, threats to kill someone. And the victim writes down what behaviors have occurred, and then it's screened, and the higher the level of risk, it gets onto the docket of this group. And so around the table will be the Attorney General, the law enforcement, advocates, DCYF if they're involved, all these different groups that don't usually collaborate very well necessarily. And we're trying to get them to say, okay, these cases, these ones that we think are going to lead to a homicide, we need you to step in proactively. And in those cases, the restraining order, because we can motivate them, the restraining order often, if that is in place, if the victim has gone and proactively gotten a restraining order, or if there is a no contact order that a judge has put in place because of a prior criminal act, there's often a way to get that abuser will re-abuse and then get arrested very quickly.
Now, how does the woman need to go to you or to go to the service to make sure that, or to tell someone about all this criteria, or if you automatically get a restraining order, is someone there? Like how?
So right now it's mostly a pilot program, so there's no specific intake way. We're discussing how we can get some sort of state system to be collecting this information over time. Hopefully maybe the top few questions are going to end up being on every single police report. The police have to fill out what's called a DVSA form for any domestic violence or sexual assault case. And so we're trying to get this on there. So right now, if the victim is cooperative, and a lot of them are, because there are a lot of people who say, look, I think I'm going to be murdered. I want to work with you as much as possible. And this is particularly those people who have recently left and because when someone leaves a relationship, an abusive relationship, the homicide risk spikes. And of course then over time, it becomes less likely that they will be murdered than they were when they were in the relationship. But there's an immediate spike that occurs. Those people are very often very willing to help. In some cases, advocates will bring a case where the victim does not feel safe cooperating. And in those cases, the committee will still assess it based on they'll pull all of the previous police reports and restraining order affidavits and any sort of public documentation about the case, and assess based on that, which sometimes is enough because in a lot of these cases, I would say that with many of the homicides that occur, there have been, the police have been involved 7 to 12 times previously. But because of the dismissal rates, because of the times when things are not charged, there may only have ever been one conviction before, and it was for something that looks minor, but it actually is showing this path of escalation. So the idea is now that we can proactively try to get involved. So we've had about 36 cases over the past year. It was the first year of the pilot that got viewed. Yes?
Are there any teeth to the restraining order? I mean, you're mentioning where, they come to the house numerous times, et cetera. Is there any by teeth? I mean, is there anything that happens to? I mean, you come to the house after the third time, you're going to be pulled in, or what are the teeth that goes along with that? Or is it just a piece of paper?
Okay, so with a restraining order, so there are two types of protective orders in the sort of domestic violence world. There are the restraining orders and there are the no contact orders. So restraining orders are civil orders that get put into place when a victim proactively goes to the court and says, I would like an order of protection. So in a restraining order case, it is always that the victim has requested it. And if at any point the victim decides they do not want that restraining order, they can go to the court and the judge will have to get rid of it. No contact orders, in effect, these are sort of the same thing. They get charged, violations get charged as the same thing. The police will come and arrest in the same way. However, no contact orders are put into place when a criminal charge is filed. So in a domestic violence case, one of the special protections that the Domestic Violence Act does is that if you're arrested for domestic violence, they can't let you out on bail or your own recognizance until they put a no contact order in place between you and the victim. In that case, a victim can go and ask a judge to get rid of it. The judge doesn't have to get rid of it. It can be put in place without the victim's permission. So in those cases, I think that in terms of, with a restraining order, when someone violates a restraining order, because that's an order that that person pretty much by definition wants to have in place, they will call the police and then they will be able to prosecute the violation of it. The no contact orders, since those are often put in place in all cases, regardless of whether the victim wants it. You have a lot of victims who say, I don't want it. And when there are violations of it, you're not going to have necessarily the same sort of cooperating witness or willingness, and when I say willingness, in many cases, a victim doesn't feel like they are in any position to stand up in front of their abuser and say to the court, oh yeah, please take him away from me, knowing that he's just going to be staying with his brother down the street and have very easy access. So, that dynamic can really change how well the prosecutions go for the protective order violations. Does that answer the question?
It answers my question. I feel like it's still, it's one of the things that you hear all the time when something happens to a victim. And it's like, well, there was a restraining order, or et cetera. It's kind of like saying, oh yeah, that his driver's license was taken away 11 times. I mean, it's like, if you can keep doing this over and over, and every Saturday night you get drunk and you go banging on that same door, and nothing happens to you, it seems like it's not worth the aggravation. Maybe I didn't say that quite politely.
No, I think you're entirely on point, and I think that this is another one of those cases where, depending on how serious the judge thinks it is in that courtroom, how serious the prosecutor thinks it is or how serious the defense attorney even thinks it is. If the culture is, oh, it's really unfair that this guy, I mean, all he was doing was trying to give her flowers on her doorstep. We're going to put him in jail for a year for that? That's so mean. You know, if that's the culture, if then even if they can prove that he was there in violation of that order, you're not going to get the parts where they have discretion around the penalties. They're not going to take it seriously in that way. They're not going to make sure that they're keeping an eye on that case. But if they can understand this issue well enough to know that he is there with flowers because every time he would beat her, he'd give her roses. So he's there with roses to let her know, I'm going to beat you. If they can make that jump, they're going to take it more seriously. So, you know, it's one of those ones where we can't really just go to the legislature and say, change the law to write in a part that says all judges have to take this seriously. It's a culture change over time.
But in a sense, that is the only way that it can be changed. In other words, right now it's up to the discretion of whatever judge you happen to go before. But if there were specific rules after the third time cops were called or after the fourth time, whatever, if you could get that part changed, then the judge would have to abide by that.
Yes, to some extent. But there's always a way for judges and prosecutors to get around it. So, for instance, the Domestic Violence Prevention Act requires that the second time you're convicted of a domestic violence crime, you have to spend a mandatory 10 days in jail. The third time you're convicted of a domestic violence crime, you have to spend a mandatory 1 year in jail. It gets escalated to a felony, heard by superior court, and then you have to spend at least a year in jail. What happens is that the prosecutors will agree to plea deals to drop the domestic part of the crime. So you were being charged with domestic simple assault because you hit your wife, and under the definition, that's considered domestic. The prosecutor will agree to just charge it as simple assault so you don't get the escalating penalties. Because the prosecutor thinks it's better to get a win than to impose the enhanced penalties. So, and at the same time, I wanted to say that, you know, as an organization, we're very committed to racial justice and civil liberties. And we know that when you take away discretion in the system and you make more and more sort of severe enhanced penalties, the people who can afford lawyers and are viewed as, oh, probably good people by the system, you're still not going to get those people because they've always been able to manipulate the system and they're going to continue to be able to. And you know that instead it's going to fall on the shoulders of one group more than others. So whenever we're weighing this and trying to figure out a strategy around it.
It is, and
you know,
most everyone knows that. If you have the money to get the best lawyer, you're going to win.
Right.
So I think we have two more questions from Erica and Nicole, and then I think we're gonna wrap up after that. So if you wanna go ahead, Erica, and then Nicole.
I know some people who, they actually fist fight with each other and they have the neighbors call, so it'll go under disorderly. I mean, yeah, it's true. They'll yell out, call the police or whatever, so, you know, if one of them calls, they know it'll be a domestic. If the neighbor calls, it's disorderly.
Yeah.
You know.
So I keep hearing people talking about how lawyers have a big, can impact what goes on appropriately, and I am a lawyer, and I just am wondering if I'm going to do pro bono hours, and I do pro bono hours, and I know a lot of people, I recently graduated, and I'm starting a job at a firm in a few months, and I have friends who are doing the same thing, and I just am wondering if the coalition, maybe, I don't know if this is the right organization, but if you could get lawyers to commit to doing a certain amount of hours a year for domestic violence work, if you guys would be able to maybe, put them in touch. Because I have friends who would probably be willing to do that, and just, I don't know, I would love to do that and to advocate and to be a lawyer, but I'm not in contact with women all the time, who, you know, have domestic
About the committee
violence.
that's been
Well,
talking about that?
there is a committee, there is a need for pro bono attorneys for divorces. So the volunteer lawyers program in Rhode Island gets a lot of requests for divorce and child custody cases, and a lot of them involve domestic violence. And not all, legal services can only handle a certain amount of the cases. And I think they can only take the cases where they're represented on a restraining order. And there are a lot of clients that maybe didn't get a restraining order or didn't go through legal services for that. So there's a long waiting list. It's something we see in my agency. I mean, we see clients who have to wait months, sometimes several months before they can even see an attorney. And then, you know, if you're familiar with the family law procedure here in Rhode Island, it's at least a 6-month process if you're on top of everything. So, you know, we have clients who sometimes have to wait over a year before they're legally divorced from their spouse. So there is a committee that's trying to work with the volunteer lawyers program to recruit more lawyers who would be willing to take on pro bono family law cases. So if that's something you're interested in, we could talk more about that. There's definitely a need for that. And then at Sojourner House, we do immigration advocacy work. So we work, we provide undocumented victims of violence with visa assistance and work visas. And we're able to do about 95% of the legal work, but we need an attorney to sign off on the petitions. So there's also a need for that too.
I know that, I don't know if that case has already come down, talking about the legality of having a la carte legal services. I was talking to Janet Gilligan about this.
Oh.
She said that they're, you know, if they ever open the door to having sort of a la carte legal services where a lawyer could just write your divorce petition and then that's the end of their relationship with you.
Oh, rather than represent you for the whole case.
Represent you for the entire maybe 2-year case.
Right.
Then they have all sorts of ideas about how they want to use volunteer attorneys. But right now, part of the problem is that what's really needed is that divorce, child custody stuff, and that is messy stuff that can last until that child is 18. So it can be hard for victims to find a volunteer attorney who can make that sort of commitment to them.
That's how I got involved with Sojourner House, actually. I met an attorney in family court who was doing work with domestic violence victims. And here I am.
It's kind of amazing when you look back and see how things
Right.
can
No,
be.
it's amazing.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So I think we can give them a round of applause if we covered a lot of ground tonight. The great part about these roundtables is we really get good discussions going, so I appreciate all the questions and interaction. And the great thing is that they both have a bunch of brochures and information over there, and we have a few more minutes, so when we're all done here, if you want to meet with them one-on-one, maybe ask a question you didn't want to ask in person, or connect on how can I use my lawyer skills for good, then please do so. Also make sure that you look for all of us on social media. I know Sojourner House and Coalition both have a strong social media presence, as is RI Now. You can find us on there and get information there. Also know that we will have a lobby training in most likely in January, so look for an announcement coming out about that. Will be a chance to learn a little bit about what lobbying is.